Okay, it's one after the hour, and it looks like most people are getting into the room. So we'll go ahead and get started here. This meeting is being recorded today. We want to welcome everybody to the meeting, this session 5 of 6 of Talking Climate Confidently about Climate Change in Indiana and Beyond. This particular session entitled Tips for Tough Conversations. I want to introduce the members of the committee that brought this together today. You have Beth Hall, the Indiana State climatologist. You have Jeff Dukes, the director of the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. Melissa Widholm, program manager for the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. Austin Pearson, Purdue Extension in Tipton County. And myself, Hans Schmitz, Purdue Extension in Posey County. We are just delighted today to have Julie Dahl with us. Since 2009, Dr. Julie E. Dahl has been the Extension and Outreach Coordinator for the Long-Term Ecological Research Project at the Kellogg Biological Station, Michigan State University. She develops programming for various stakeholders, including farmers, extension educators, policymakers, teachers, students, and the general public, on ecology and field crop agriculture with an emphasis on climate change. Previously, she worked as a postdoctoral research associate and graduate research assistant in the agronomy department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her dissertation research investigated agronomic, ecological, and social aspects to using native prairie grasses and grazed pastures. As a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay from 2000 to 2002, Julie fell in love with working with farmers, grasslands, and meeting the needs of people through improved agricultural production and care for the environment. She is passionate about strengthening the linkages between people, agriculture, and the environment. So with that introduction, I will go ahead and turn it over to Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you to the entire planning committee for the invitation to present. I know that you guys have presented some great information already through this series, and I'm hoping this will be an informative and kind of fun conversation on how we might take some of that information and think about sharing it and facilitating conversations with our stakeholders on this topic of climate change. I know that you, as the organizing committee, have a great deal of experience on this topic, and I looked over the registration list as well, and it's very clear that the participants who are here today also have a lot of wisdom on this topic too. So I am excited to learn from you all as well, with any insights or experiences you can share on how you have what you think effectively communicated and facilitated dialogue on this topic of climate change. So with that, in that spirit, I ask that participants go ahead and share a word or a sentence in the chat that helps us understand either your feelings or your experiences with climate change communication. And I'll be quiet for about 30 seconds and invite you, if you're willing, to share a few words via the chat. This is really great. So we are seeing a range of experiences and thoughts, right? From hopelessness to, the importance of the topic, to feeling maybe a little overwhelmed and frustrated on how we might, converse about this topic as well. Also some calls of, it's potentially divisive or politically charged. And I think that these experiences are real, and that I know I've experienced a lot of the same questions and emotions when it comes to communicating about climate change. So thank you for sharing that. I'm hopeful today that we can maybe think through together some tips and guidelines for how this might, be made a little bit easier for those of us who work in this area. And so for today, I'm going to start with kind of framing, why is a dialogue-based approach important when we're talking about climate change? We'll go over some science-based communication guiding principles specific to climate change. We'll think through a communication plan, and then I'll share some examples, 2 examples, of how colleagues of mine and myself, worked with these guiding principles in a communication plan to put on programming in Michigan related to climate change. All right, so that's our roadmap for today. I'm going to turn off my video while I present, and I'm excited. Thank you all for being here. Let's get started. All right, so when we think about communication, there's different facets of communication. One facet is certainly, kind of a one-way imparting or, interchange of thoughts, opinions, information by speech, writing, or signs. And this can be an important way to communicate, about science or climate change, right? Many of us write press releases about research or programs. We may share things via social media. We may send out a fact sheet or a newsletter. It's kind of this one way, like let's share what we've learned. It's an important piece of communication. It's not the piece we're going to focus on as much today. The facet of communication that I work mostly with is this level of communication. So the two-way process of reaching mutual understanding, in which participants not only exchange information, news or ideas and feelings, but they also create and share meaning. So why might we want to do this type of communication when it comes to an issue like climate change? Suzanne Moser is what I would call a leader thinker in the climate change communication research world and outreach world. This information is from one of her books. You have a reference and a complete citation for this on the last slide of the handout that Hans emailed earlier today. So you have all the references that I'll use today on those slides. So Susie really points out a case for dialogue when it comes to communication on climate change. She says that mass kind of one-way communication on this topic is not enough. It doesn't create a solid bond that really helps us move forward. She posits that we need more safe forums for deeper social engagement, ongoing dialogue, and social accountability. What she's learned and what the research shows is that to change our behavior, we need social support. And, one example or 2 examples of this could be, the social supports we have in other areas of our life. For example, Weight Watchers, right? There's a reason people join that. They need some social support and motivation to make some hard changes in their life. Or churches, people join churches for that social support on like how to, be a certain or live a certain type of way. And so that carries through with topics like climate change too. As we're asking ourselves or society or different sectors of the economy to change, social support is going to be critical in moving forward. Another reason dialogue is important and can be supportive is that climate change can be really overwhelming, and it can lead to this sense of, inaction. So one example I have from my own life, I'll never forget this day. It was June 6, 2012, you can see in the headline. I headed into my office, had my cup of coffee, sat down 7 a.m. to read the news, and this was the headline. Earth is headed for disaster, this interdisciplinary team of scientists concludes. This interdisciplinary group of 22 scientists combined all this evidence, and they've concluded that the Earth appears headed toward catastrophic and irreversible environmental changes. I remember thinking like, well, what's the point? What am I even doing here at my desk? If this is the trajectory that we're headed on, and there's no point. So, and that includes climate change. It can be overwhelming. There's a lot of hard kind of news that we have to digest. And I think if we can encourage dialogue around the topic, it can really help kind of keep us motivated and keep us seeing that, there definitely are things we can do to address climate change. You have this reference in your handout. This is one of the best references I have found. I've used it for years to help me think through how to communicate about climate change. This is a synthesis piece. It pulls on all sorts of different disciplines of research, including communication research, psychology research, to provide some really useful tips on climate change communication. So I highly recommend this, and I believe it's available free as a download, as a PDF. So this report offers 10 guiding principles, and we don't have time to delve into each of them or share examples about each of them. But what I would love to do is just read you the 10 principles, and then we'll move forward and we'll delve into a couple of them specifically. But just know that this resource is available for you to learn about the specifics of each guiding principle. So allow me to read these. I know it's a lot of text, but let's just work through the 10. Number 1, put yourself in your audience's shoes. Number 2, channel the power of groups, and I would add in group discussion. Number 3, emphasize the solutions and the benefits that are there and possible. Number 4, bring climate change impacts close to home. Number 5, connect climate change to issues that matter to your audience. Number 6, use images and stories to make climate change real. Number 7, make climate science meaningful. Number 8 is really important. Acknowledge uncertainty, but show what you know. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one later. Number 9, approach skepticism carefully. And number 10, make behavior change easy, or I would say make it a little easier or make it seem approachable. So I know that's a lot to digest right now, but we will get into a few specifics. So that first one, put yourself in your audience's shoes. We are so fortunate in this country just to have incredible researchers who have been thinking about, how people are perceiving climate change for years now. One of the leading groups on this is out of Yale. So they have a climate communication program. Since 2008, they have been tracking how Americans believe in and understand climate change. What they found is that over time, most Americans kind of group into one of 6 kind of thought processes or beliefs about climate change. And so this Yale group has titled this the 6 Americas. And you can see these cartoons depicting the 6 Americas on the slide. So starting at the top left, we have the alarmed. These are folks who are the most concerned, the most motivated about climate change. These go down in a spectrum all the way down to the bottom right, to the dismissive. So those are the least concerned and the least motivated to do something about climate change. So in between those two, we have folks who are concerned, folks who are cautious. Maybe they want to learn more about it. They're not quite sure, what's going on. Folks who are disengaged. And I like to remember that there's lots of people who are disengaged, and there's lots of reasons why they're disengaged, right? So right now is a tough time, right? With COVID-19 and people losing their jobs, etc. Sometimes we just have a lot of other stuff going on, and we as humans have what psychologists call a finite pool of worry, and sometimes climate change doesn't fit in there. So I try to have grace for folks who are disengaged. We have those who are doubtful, maybe they're not, don't really think something's going on, and then I already mentioned the dismissive. So this next slide, I'm going to show you some of the data. So this Yale group has been polling Americans since 2008 and listing out the percentages of, who is in the alarm group, concerned group, etc. So I want you to get a picture in your mind, like circles of, different size circles. Who do you think in your mind is, like, how many alarmed would it be? Would it be a big circle of the population or little? What about cautious? What about disengaged? Kind of try to map out what you think, how Americans map out along this spectrum. All right, well, the last time this poll was taken was November 2019, and here's what it looked like. So we have over almost a third of Americans who are very alarmed about climate change. 26 are concerned, 16% cautious, and then we have the disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. These circles, do vary a little bit over time. In 2019, that was the highest percentage that self kind of categorized as alarmed. There is a self-assessment. It's super short. You can do on this Yale communication page. So you can take a quiz and it will show you, where do you fall along the 6 Americas? Here's a slide showing how those percentages have changed, what the 5-year trend is. So as I mentioned, the alarmed has seen a big increase, almost a tripling since 2014. And the dismissive and the doubtful have kind of bounced around, but collectively they've lost about 5 percentage points. So I show this information because I think it's really important to understand, where does your audience lie? And then that will help you think through, well, what kind of information is best to share, or what topics would be best to share during a conversation. I know there's some programs actually give that quiz or give a similar type of quiz to their audience at the beginning of a program and say, how do we sort out as a group here? And then they show the results and they can talk through it. And that's been helpful. My area of focus, as Hans mentioned in the introduction, is in agriculture. And so most of the work I do is with farmers and the ag professional community. There's an incredible amount of research in the Midwest on how farmers and ag professionals are viewing and understanding climate change. Efforts by J.A. Arbuckle and Linda Procopi, they've done some really large-scale survey work. So if you're in the ag world, you have a lot of information at your fingertips of understanding your audience and therefore being able to put yourself in your audience's shoes. And I'm happy to send links and references to that. All right, so now that you potentially have a little bit better idea about your audience, it's time to start thinking through, well, what are we going to talk about? Or how can I, plan this program? And so this was another one of your handouts that Hans sent out. It's actually a 2-page communication planning worksheet, and I only sent Hans the first page, so I'll correct that, and maybe Hans can send a follow-up email, including the second page of this worksheet. This was from a workshop that Suzanne Moser put on that I found incredibly helpful. And I use this kind of communication planning tool both for, I guess if we're thinking about like a press release or like a newsletter, but also pulling from it the pieces that I can to help me think through, a more dialogue-based program that I might run. Okay, so let's walk through this, and then with Hans, we're going to kind of delve into some specifics about how you might really use this communication plan. We're going to have a back and forth with me and Hans, and he's going to share some thoughts. All right, so number 1, the audience characteristics. We've talked about that. So what are their values? What are their attitudes? What are their concerns and priorities? Number 2, a communication goal. This is something that is so important, and I see a lot of, scientists kind of miss this whole part of the communication goal, and they focus more on what tactic would they use. So it's so key to think, as I'm planning this conversation, what is my goal? Do I want to inform and educate? That's a great goal within itself. Or do I want to elicit a certain type of behavioral response? Do I want to change a social norm? And it is really critical to be as specific as possible. And then I would even, say for your program, like share that goal with the audience. Today we're just here to learn. I shouldn't say just. Today we're here to learn more about climate science. Or, today we're here to think through how we might better, whatever you fill in the blank. Okay. Next is framing. I'm not going to get a lot into this. There's a lot on framing in that report that I shared at the beginning with the guiding principles. It's just thinking of a way to help kind of understand the value behind your audience and what might resonate well with them. Here's page 2 of the communication plan that you don't have yet, but you will. So it just helps you think of some draft messages. then identifying potential messengers or even media that might help share and might help really, who are the people your audience trust is the question I always ask right here when we think about identifying messengers. So we're going to get into that a little bit with Hans. So if Hans doesn't mind unmuting his microphone, I'm going to walk through a couple of these questions of a communication plan with Hans, and hopefully you'll see, how Hans as an extension educator, might use this kind of plan in his programming. So Hans, are you ready?
Sure.
Awesome. All right. So Hans, let's say it's like, a more typical year where you could get together in person very easily with a certain audience under your kind of program area. And you're going to dialogue about climate change. You're going to facilitate this conversation. So choose an audience for us. Like, which audience would you like to meet with and hold this conversation with?
I think I'm going to throw a little curveball and go with a gardening audience.
Awesome. I love it. All right, Hans, in your experience, what do the gardeners care about? What might be their concerns or priorities? What do you know about what they know or think about climate change?
Well, the gardening audience is going to care about, first and foremost, they showed up because they identify as a gardener, so they care about growing good produce or tending the landscape in a successful way. So the first thing on their mind at any get together focused around gardening is going to be the garden.
Okay.
And so when we talk about climate, we've got to talk about it as it affects the garden, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so they might be really interested in like what the temperature is going to be doing over time, or if they're going to get enough rain for their garden, these kind of things.
Yeah, they're interested in the fact that maybe their tomatoes are acting weird, and it happens to be because of Jeff Duke's swamp cooler metaphor, turning up those nighttime summer low temperatures and delaying the onset of ripe fruit. You know,
Got it. Okay. So it sounds like you know a lot about your audience already, which is great. As you're working with them or facilitating this conversation, why are you doing that? What's your goal? What might be a goal you'd have for this group?
so usually two goals. One is going to be to help them um, make more informed decisions that uh, positively affect their garden.
Hmm.
And then the underlying goal, no matter what audience I'm talking to about climate change, is to increase their, well, the point of this, increase their confidence in bringing up starting the conversation, initiating the conversation, or talking about climate change.
Got it. Okay. So even within, so I'm imagining a stream of gardeners, like even, as they're going out after the meeting, them feeling more confident to talk about it with their business partners or their families or whoever they're gardening with or people who comment on their garden, that kind of thing.
Certainly.
All right. Okay, last question for you, Hans. So this might, who is the best messenger for this? Who would these gardeners trust?
Okay, I have two responses to that.
Tell me.
Um, it doesn't matter what audience she speaks in front of. She brings a clear, concise message and has clout as uh, research-based conveyor of science, and that would be Melissa Woodholm. Second messenger, and there are many, many, many gardeners in Indiana that are excellent, but hardly a one I know does not know the name Joellen Myers Sharp because of her publications in various statewide media. And she would be a messenger with the ability to get the message out to a large number of people.
Awesome. And if it sounds like if either of these two women were in the room, even if folks maybe didn't understand the science behind human-induced climate change, because it came from these professionals who they've known for a while, they like, or they've heard from for a while, it might kind of really help the message being relayed.
Correct. Yes.
So I think that this is something so hugely important. And for scientists, I think sometimes it takes a big dose of humility to think, maybe I'm not the best messenger for this particular group. Now, rest assured, the science, the polling does show that overall scientists still are very well respected and trusted. And yet we just need to acknowledge that there are going to be other people who are very well respected and trusted too in communities. And so as we're thinking about working with communities, I think it's key, and the science shows the message is going to be better received. There is going to be kind of more of a jumpstart towards action if it comes from someone that they trust. And when we think about communities, who do people trust? So Hans, you listed some very specific to gardeners. We also know pediatricians are very well trusted. Pastors can be very well trusted. Who are the moral thought leaders in a community? And so I think it's important to think creatively as you're designing programming. Is there someone else who can deliver this message or facilitate this conversation, or someone who can stand next to me and deliver it, right? So I'll give an example of this in Kalamazoo. I was asked to speak on climate change to a group of downtown Kalamazoo churches. They wanted to learn about climate change. So I thought a lot about, how might I frame this for this audience? These organizations, specifically, I already knew these churches were very interested in kind of social justice and serving underrepresented or, poor communities across the world. So there was a lot that they wanted to learn about how climate change might affect those populations. What was really key, right? So I still was going to be giving the message, the science message, but it was great that one of the pastors of the churches stood up with me next to her and said, this is Julie. Here's why this topic is so important to our congregation. Here's why I really hope you listen to Julie, right? She was the best messenger to ask the congregation to be open to listening to the climate science. And I still gave the science part, but the fact that she introduced me, really, really was key. All right, Hans, I appreciate you working through this with me. I'm hopeful that worksheet is useful as people are moving their programs forward. All right, so in the remaining time, I want to share two examples from Michigan of how colleagues and I have used these guiding principles to reach target audiences. And like I said, my target audience is in the agricultural world for the most part. And so these examples stem from ag. However, I think maybe the format or the guiding principles we used can be translated to many other sectors, including health or community planning, etc. So I'm looking forward to sharing these with you and then getting, any feedback you have in the chat. Have you used this process before? What do you think would work or not work with this process? And even if we can't get to all of your comments in the chat, do enter them in, because I'll mull over those. I'm going to save the chat, and it will really help me think through my next programming. And maybe we could, maybe we could host another conversation over time virtually and learn from each other. All right, so the first example I'd like to use is what I call learning from leaders. And this is an example of using a farmer panel or an expert panel. So I developed programming with a colleague from Nebraska. We hosted kind of regional workshops on climate change and agriculture, and the audience was extension educators. And so as we were thinking through, well, who would be, a trusted messenger for extension educators? Who would they want to hear from on climate change? It became very clear it was farmers. These were extension educators in the ag sector. And so, In this instance and many other meetings, I have asked thoughtful, willing farmers if they would get up in front of a group and I could facilitate them through a conversation on climate change and how it affects their farming production. These farmers kind of covered a wide range. I think we had different crops represented. We had livestock farmers, and they were all very eloquent in their way of speaking of the challenges they were facing dealing with climate change on their farms. And I will tell you that I think that had way more impact than me getting up in front of the extension educators and kind of talking through why farms might be affected by climate change. And these farmer panels have consistently kind of been one of the most highly rated things when we do our evaluation of programs. The guiding principles I used as I was, thinking about incorporating something like this was connect climate change to issues that matter to your audience, and then use images and stories to make climate change real. And farmers are so good at using, images in their words and telling stories of what it's like to farm. I will say that, panels in general can fall really flat, so you have to put a lot of work into kind of coaching the participants or giving them the questions beforehand, thinking of really thoughtful questions, and not letting one person dominate, etc. But if you put the hard work in, my experience has been that something like a farmer panel or a community member panel or a gardener panel might be a really nice way to effectively kind of communicate about climate change. And then from the panel, what we do is usually break into small groups and kind of digest what we've just heard. And I would have a farmer in each of those small groups to help do that. So there's one example. I'll be curious to read the chat, see if others have had other experiences using panels. The second example is going to take a little bit longer to explain. And it's because it uses a technique that I had not been familiar with before starting at MSU. This technique is called a fishbowl. So this is a communication technique that involves organizing a group into two groups, either speakers or listeners/observers. And you do this in order for all voices in a room to be heard. So it usually involves two rings of chairs in the actual room, okay? So imagine you have this big room, you have a center ring of chairs, that's the inner ring. Those are the people who are in the fishbowl, so to speak, because they are going to be observed and listened to by this outer ring of participants in the room. This reference is also on the last slide that you have, so you have the link to this great reference. Why might we want to use a facilitation technique like a fishbowl? Now think specifically to climate change as well. So this slide has a lot of text, and I apologize for that, but I really feel so strongly that this is a great facilitation tool. So I kind of want to give you a lot of background information on it. So there's three reasons or three kind of purposes of this approach of the fishbowl. The first, strategically selecting a few members from the group to have a focused conversation while others observe can help reveal key points of agreement or disagreement. And this may advance consensus of the group if you're working towards consensus for something. Another purpose of this technique is in the case of strongly conflicting opinions. So one group has the ability to discuss their views while the other group listens. And then the sides exchange locations, right? So then the other group comes in the fishbowl, comes in the center, so that both perspectives are fairly presented. All right, lastly, in situations where one group is usually considered learners or listeners or followers, and the other group historically has been considered the teacher or the speaker or the leader, this kind of technique allows the learners to be speaking while the teachers listen. So it's kind of a turnabout in roles. And so you'll see in the next couple slides that, I use this approach for climate change because it can be an issue of strongly conflicting opinions, like number 2. And it also involved groups where, some were usually considered the speakers and others were usually considered the listeners, and I wanted to turn that around. All right, so here's how we did it. We, and I think around 2012, 2013, held a series of these fishbowl conversations across Michigan. It was once again with the ag sector, and it was a new way for us to dialogue. We had not used this approach before specifically for ag and climate change. Here's how we did it. First, we had the scientist and extension specialist speak on climate change. So that was our one group, science/extension. The farmers were our second group who were also in the room, and they were listening. So they were in that outer ring. Here we have our beloved retired extension specialist, Dr. Dale Much, who was presenting to the farmers on some of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, etc. So we had about 3, maybe 4 scientists or extension specialists speak first. They were in that fishbowl. They were listened to by the farmers. And that's pretty typical, right? At least, in a lot of extension programs, that's kind of feels really natural and normal. The scientist or the extension person would talk, the farmers would listen. But here's where we turned it around. Then we had the scientists and the extension folks sit in the outer ring of the circle, and the farmers sat in the middle. I then led the farmers through a series of questions. It was basically like a focus group, like, well, how are you experiencing climate change? And we had this incredibly rich conversation with the farmers on climate change while the scientists and extension educators listened in that outer ring. And it was interesting just even observing body language. I think that was hard for some of them. They were used to adding in or asking questions and whatnot. And so it was like a strict rule, like you cannot interject if you're in that outer ring. So they took notes. Overall, they did great. And then at the end, what we did is we brought the scientists and the farmers together, and we worked through kind of questions like, what did you learn from the other group? How might we move forward on helping agriculture adapt to climate change in Michigan, etc. So this fishbowl technique really did 3 main things for us. It channeled that power of groups and dialogue. The farmers so articulately used images and stories to make climate change real, and the scientists really heard them, right? And then from the scientist perspective, the scientists were able to share what they know. They were able to acknowledge what uncertainties there might be and projections, but they did. They showed what they knew, and they were able to be heard by the farmers as well. I will say that one thing I've learned is that to host conversations like this, I think it's really important to lay down ground rules for discussion. So here's just a tip. I always have ground rules for discussion either up on a PowerPoint slide or I have them up on a flip chart piece of paper. I keep them very simple. I share them with a group before the discussion, and then I ask, does anyone have anything they'd like to add, or does anyone, disagree with any of these ground rules? So everyone buys in, right? We adjust them if needed. Here are some I use frequently with groups. Listen to understand, stay focused on the task, be brief so that everyone has a chance to share, and do not interrupt. And so I do this to set the tone for the meeting. I do this because then everyone has buy-in to what the ground rules are. And I will tell you, it's been so interesting. People actually during the discussion will point to the ground rules like, oh, I better not talk so much. I don't want to talk so much and monopolize the conversation. So they'll refer back to these ground rules. It sounds like a very simple kind of thing to do, but in my experience, it's been a powerful facilitation technique for having some of these tougher conversations on climate change. All right, well, what did our participants think of this approach? This was new. This is very new for the farmers and very new for the scientists. So we worked with our evaluation specialist, Cheryl Eschbach at MSU Extension. And so she did an evaluation of the participants and found that, across all these settings in Michigan, 100% of the farmers said that the discussion format was a comfortable setting. And that was pretty incredible, right? Because we were talking about climate change, and we were talking about climate change in 2012, 2013. when maybe it wasn't quite as understood or acknowledged as it is now in the ag community. 98% of farmers felt completely listened to at the event, and they agreed that they had gained something from the discussion. And 100% of the farmers agreed that the discussion was an effective way to gather information. And so hopefully, as you know, I've kind of talked through the process of this. There's a lot more in the fishbowl guide that you have the reference for, but hopefully you've maybe see, well, hey, this could be, you know, a tool I use for the health sector, or, you know, what other kind of groups of professionals or community members you're working with. So I'm going to be really curious to read the chat and see your thoughts on this, or, you know, from your opinion, what might not work about this approach. Do you see any kind of like red flags why this might not work for the groups that you work with? So our evaluation specialist asked our scientists and extension educators some qualitative questions about the process, asking them to reflect on it. And here's what one of our extension educators said after going through this series of fishbowls across the state. This educator said, one farmer I had been working with on a separate project had expressed doubts about climate change. However, after participating in the 2013 discussion, this farmer said, I think there might be something to this climate change stuff. So this educator found it to be a really useful process. They'd already been working, you know, with this group on climate change, maybe hadn't made as much traction, but there was something about this process, I think, where farmers really felt listened to and heard, that kind of built some trust and helped move the programming forward for climate change. There are so many other incredible resources out there, and there's just a wealth of information that I've included in the reports that I shared with you today to delve into. So I hope that, you know, I was able just to give you a glimpse into some of what has been helpful for me and my colleagues here in Michigan. I'm excited to hear any thoughts you have, and I would welcome any questions. So thank you so much for your time. And, you know, our time right now is one of our most precious commodities we each have. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this discussion. And I would love for you to reach out and email me if you have any questions or thoughts or critical feedback for me on kind of what we've been attempting to do here in Michigan. So with that, Hans, I'm ready for some discussion with the participants.
That sounds great. Before we start with the questions, I am going to open the poll for today, the end poll, and give you about 3 minutes to fill that out. Jeff Dukes has been watching the chat very patiently during the discussion, and he will lead the question session.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of good back and forth in the chat. People are providing some really great ideas and good feedback, and we have some good questions too. So the first one I will pitch to you is from Brenna Friday, and it is, Julie, are there any resources from your farmer panels that you could share? We'd love to hear their stories.
Oh, that's a great question. So I have a couple thoughts, and maybe if you put your email in the chat, I'll know exactly, you know, how to send this to you. So the first is, I'm absolutely happy to share the questions we've used for the farmer panel. So if that's a good resource as you're thinking about hosting a panel, that would be great. The second thing is, you know, brings up a really good point. So during the conferences, you know, I've been hosting these farmer panels, and I have not been able to take really great notes on what the farmers were saying because I was trying to facilitate the dialogue. So that's just a tip, right? Like, get someone to be a good note taker for you. But what I do have for you is a paper I published a couple years ago with colleagues. We actually went across Michigan and held discussions with farmers, just farmers. So it wasn't the Fishbowl project, but just farmers, asking for their impressions of and how they were experiencing climate change. And so we synthesized that information and we did publish it, and I'm absolutely happy to share that paper with you. That would give you a really nice insight into how they're thinking about climate change, and we use a lot of quotes in there so you actually hear it kind of from their own words. That might be a helpful resource.
Great. Okay, and we're open for more questions in the chat if anyone wants to put them in. But the second question I've pulled out is from Karina Ismendi, and it is, can you say ideas of how to address groups that are mostly apathetic? So Karina is a teacher, and she has a lot of kids that don't want to be in school at all. And she's gotten a couple suggestions from others in the chat about this. But if you have thoughts on apathetic groups, that'd be great.
Yeah, that is so it's kind of, you know, thinking towards maybe a group who might be a little more cautious or even disengaged. So, you know, not knowing the age group of the student or if they're in a particular major or class, I wonder if there isn't a group of students or an individual student who's working on the issue of climate change who might be invited as a guest, like via Skype or Zoom for the classroom. There are some incredible youth-led programs for climate change, actually around the globe. And some of these students are so inspiring. I've used some of the videos that these students have created when I've done programming, and there's something about it. You know, you see these 12-year-olds leading these really thoughtful programs on climate change, either mitigation or adaptation. There's something about that that can be really inspiring. And so I wonder if we can't find, you know, a group or, you know, an individual who might be in that same peer group as your student. I also wonder
She
if,
says,
oh,
so just
go
she
ahead.
says the peer group is poor inner city eighth graders.
Yes. Well, let me think on that. So there might be some kind of urban climate change or, you know, some work along the environmental justice realm for climate change. I'll put some thought into that. And then the other, you know, I'm just trying to think of, you know, who might be a trusted messenger for this group. You would know better than I would. And if having either a panel or a guest speaker in there, um, that could be, you know, just something that might resonate a little bit with them and hearing how maybe one of their community members is suffering from climate change. Um, there's a project out of Wisconsin. It's called the Climate Voices. They have a really great, actually an incredible video series. They're short video clips that cover the different kind of sectors and main interests in Wisconsin. So they have like ice fishing and farming, and they have a really, really nice one from, I think it's Milwaukee, and it talks about urban challenges of climate change, and it talks about the heat, you know, the urban heat islands that you get and how that's affecting, and it's just really well done. So that might be a resource too.
That's great, Julie. And she's getting other tips in the chat as well.
Awesome.
So hopefully this has been helpful in a couple ways. So you have a couple questions now that I'll pull together. They're both basically like, how do you get farmers into a room to do this? So one is just simply basically that. It seems to be a large hurdle to get people to come to a meeting. And another question is about whether, you know, you had to pay them for something like this. So there's, I think this is a challenge that a lot of people are experiencing.
You know, it is. So I am not, I'm not formally with MSU Extension, so I rely a lot on our extension educators at MSU who have these trusted relationships with farmers. And so they would often send the personal invite. They would make the phone call to the farmer, or they would send the email saying, hey, I have someone I'd really love for you to chat with. Her name's Julie, you know, so it's a lot of that kind of process. The other thing that you know, I think helped us was that when we initially started having these focus groups with farmers to ask about climate change, we specifically said, we need your help, because we did. We needed their perspective on, you know, what programming might be useful, or not even, you know, just like what is needed from MSU to help them address some of these changing weather patterns that they're experiencing. And so just asking for help and saying, you know, your input is really going to help us plan our programming, that seemed to be effective as well. When we held the all-day kind of fishbowl meeting, I don't believe we provided an honorarium. I think we may have reimbursed for mileage and then offered a nice lunch just to, you know, like respect their time. if you could offer an honorarium, that would be great. That might be hard, you know, this year and next year. I know budgets are really tight right now. Does that help? I'm curious if
I
there's
think that's
other,
great. I think that's great.
yeah,
There's one
okay.
nuance on that, and I have also seen that food is very good. Free food is very good at bringing people together. But there's one more nuance of that is one of our participants is particularly interested in bringing in contrarian farmers or farmers associated with big ag or intensive ag,
Yeah.
as opposed to the more agroecological farms.
Yep. So um, I think there's a couple ways you could go about this. And I'm gonna rely on, you know, the extension folks of the planning committee to chime in too. So I think it depends on the goal of your meeting or your program, right? So if it's about, you know, maybe helping farmers make some changes on their farm to deal with climate change, one tactic our extension group has used, you know, is not using the word climate change in the program or in the title. And so actually making it really real for farmers, like, okay, well, climate change is really big, but you know, you invite them to a program on mitigating heavy rain events or the damage of heavy rain events on their cropping system. And so maybe you're not using kind of the broader climate change term. You're specifically talking about the effect that is really hard for them to deal with. And that seems, you know, that has seemed to resonate with the farmers that are invited. Another thought is that things are very, you know, different now. I think there's more and more big ag and more groups acknowledging that things are changing, that agriculture is facing challenges. And so I think there's a real opportunity now where maybe we didn't have as 10 years ago. You know, even some of the proposed bills coming through the Senate have the support of corn growers and Farm Bureau and whatnot to address climate change. So I think there's more room now than there used to be. And then finally, when I speak with farmers and groups, you know, of all sorts of farmers, here's kind of what I say just up front. I say, you know, listen, this conversation of climate change is happening at our state level, it's happening at local levels, it's happening globally. My job and what I want to do is just keep you updated, right? It's like, to me, it's actually just a matter of respect. Like, I want you to know what the conversation is. I want you to know how others are thinking about this, you know, across our state, across our country. And farmers have come up to me and said, you know, that was like the most unbiased talk I've ever heard. And I think they just really responded to the respect I was showing them that, you know, you're part of this, like, and let's just have a conversation about it.
That's great. I think that leads into a couple other questions. I'm going to pair two questions together here that sort of touch on that. And so one is from Amy Kristen Presson, and it is, does the success of the fishbowl discussion change based on the makeup of the audience in regards to the 6 types of citizens? Have you facilitated discussions with a lot of apathetic or doubtful or dismissive people? So that's one question. And the other one is similar and related from Whitney Presby, and that is, were there any climate deniers in the fishbowl? Were you concerned that if there was strong conflicting opinions among the farmers, that this activity could fall into the trap that the media often falls into when they have a climate scientist and a climate denier on for interviews, sort of paired, which suggests there isn't scientific consensus on the topic?
Okay, so Jeff, I'm gonna work through the questions and then you chime in if I'm missing a piece of a question. So I might tackle the second question first. So with the fish bowls, so one thing I really like about the fishbowl, you know, no one can be forced to listen, right? You can't force someone to listen and really hear another perspective or another side. But as facilitators, what we can do is do the best we can to make that possibility happen. And so, you know, even if there would have been what we call maybe a denier in the group, you know, because of the very kind of formal setup of you're going to listen now and the others get to talk, I think that because people had a chance to talk and be heard, that they were more open to then listening. The other thing I would say is that I think there are fewer and fewer at least farmers, who would say there's absolutely nothing changing with the climate. And so I think some of the denial piece is much more linked to, in my experience and in the data, that okay, fine, things are changing, but maybe humans aren't the ones who are causing the change. And so I think it goes back to what your goal is of the meeting. You know, if you want to start to develop programming or think about management that helps farmers adapt to climate change, then maybe that piece of the denial is not as important for that conversation. If what you're doing is really trying to work towards a policy or a program that mitigates climate change from agriculture, then yeah, that piece would be really important. So I know it's kind of a complicated answer, but it really depends on the goal and whatnot. But that technique of the fishbowl, I think it sets you up for one of the better case scenarios that you could have if you know that there are, you know, deniers, or for lack of a better term. And Jeff, the first question, did I cover that enough?
I think you did, actually, because that
Okay.
was about whether the makeup of the audience affects how the fishbowl goes and how you
Okay.
deal with it. And so I think
Right.
your answer pretty much took care of that. So another question is from Craig Williams, and it sort of starts with an observation. He likes the climate communication website at Yale, and said if you look at the opinion maps, lots of people believe that plants and animals and people will be affected way in the future, but they don't think it's going to affect them personally, or is affecting people in the US, or is affecting people now. It seems
Yeah.
like they're seeing it as a far off issue. So the question is, should it be more of a priority to spread awareness of the urgency of addressing climate change and try to move people from the cautious and concerned camp groups into the alarm group, as opposed to trying to convince the doubtful and dismissive of the validity of the science?
What a strategic question. That's great. So I'll tell you where I'm at with it. And I am so open to hearing Hans and Melissa, your guys' thoughts on all of your guys' thoughts on this too. So yes, the science shows that people think, for the most part, climate change is going to affect poor people somewhere else, right? I would say that, unfortunately, you know, we are increasingly experiencing some very local personal effects of climate change. So in the Midwest, right, there's been a lot of communities flooded out. I mean, man, we had a bad, like Michigan, Midland, Michigan had a horrible flood this spring, and other areas have flooded out. I'm sure in your areas too. Um, and so I think that that's going to change over time, just because I think we're going to be feeling the impact more, you know, on the local level. But to answer the strategic part of your question, so I have shifted my resources to working towards what I call and what is called that movable middle. So the cautious, or you know, that group, and working with that, what's called the movable middle. And I have kind of not allocated resources into the dismissive group. That percentage of like 10%, you know, it's probably going to stay there. You know, there's still percentages of people who, you know, don't think, I don't know, what's an example, who don't think, you know, smoking is harmful. Like there's just always going to be that percentage of people, I think. And so if I had limited time and limited resources, which I think we all do, I would focus on either supporting that alarmed and concerned group, helping them think through adaptation and mitigation, or I would be focusing my resources on that movable middle, and helping them, you know, understand more about what's going on and what can be done. Jeff, what's your take on? I mean, I don't want to put the spotlight on you, but you or Hans, like, how are you guys thinking about that?
Personally, I agree. I think there's limited return on investment in trying to move people who are very comfortable in their position at one end of the spectrum, and so I'd rather talk to people who are genuinely curious and genuinely want to become more educated, than spend too much time essentially being toyed with or playing games with people who really have no interest in having an honest discussion.
Hans, what about you?
You reminded me a little bit of John Oliver when he talks about whether hats are real. And if somebody doesn't believe hats are real, do you want to spend a lot of energy trying to convince them of the fact that hats are real? So yes, the movable middle is where I would like to spend my time as well.
Hans, have you kind of seen the same thing in Indiana that I've seen in Michigan, where over time, over the last 10 years, farmers are definitely seeing more changes on the ground and are more open to at least trying to figure out what to do about, the flooding or the drought?
Yes, definitely. Farmers are seeing changes, they're acknowledging the changes, and they're wanting to change their practices to mitigate risk.
So there's one more question that is very specific that maybe if you have a quick thought on that, we can take it and then we should wrap this up. And that is,
Yep.
This comes from Gretchen Duff, who's on a homeowners association, or who's I guess on a homeowners association with a precedent for denying solar panel applications because of architectural reasons. They're waiting for state precedent on legislation or something like this. But they're going to get a discussion going on this. And she says, without sounding like a tree hugger, do you have any suggestions to drive this home? I guess that solar panels should be okay in a very conservative area. We can't do a fishbowl right now, so it is all online.
Yeah, I know. Man, this all online thing is hard, isn't it? Because it is harder to have a dialogue online, and yet it can be done. And so I would recommend going to this report. This is my short answer. Go to this report, look up the chapter on framing. I think there's some framing on, conserving energy or economic cost or return on investment that, if you can find someone in the state or in the region who can speak on kind of the economics of why this might make sense or might kind of make that community more resilient, that could be one way to frame it and start to have meaningful dialogue. So that would be my short answer on that, Jeff.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Julie. I think this has been a fantastic session. We got a lot of good questions answered, and I'm sure that all of us have learned a lot of useful techniques for communicating on this front. So much appreciated. We hope that all of you in the audience will return on Thursday when we'll be having discussions about what we can do about climate change. What are some climate change solutions that we can put in place, whether it's limiting the amount of climate change through solar panels on homeowners' roofs or other methods, and what are the things we can do to adapt to it? How can we minimize the impacts of climate change, the unavoidable climate change that's already here, and we know that more is already coming. So to all of you who were here at the beginning of the call, thanks for filling out the poll. We'll try to make sure that the breakout session that you're in is one that you're interested in and that it's relevant, is as relevant to you as possible. And thanks for joining again for the whole team. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.